Section 1. The Moors, the Wind, and Three Shadows of Genius. There are few landscapes in England as hauntingly poetic as the Yorkshire moors. Vast, untamed, and forever brushed by wind, they seem alive. Rolling stretches of heather that sigh beneath the oaken sky, whispering secrets to those who listen. And it was in this isolated world, in a modest parsonage on the edge of the village of Haworth, that three sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Brontë, began to dream. The year was the early 1800s, a time when the world was still ruled by rigid expectations, when women were meant to be quiet, domestic, and unseen. Yet in this little house, three minds burned brighter than anyone could have imagined. The Brontë sisters, tucked away from the bustle of London's literary scene, would create stories that outlived empires, tales of wild passion, independence, and tragedy. But their own lives would mirror their fiction, filled with both brilliance and heartbreak, success and sorrow. Their stories were not only written on paper, but carved into the quiet rhythm of their days. The sound of a quill scratching late into the night, the soft creak of a wooden floor as one sister paced, thinking through the life of a character who refused to rest until she was complete. The parsonage itself was a place of solitude and storm. Their father, Patrick Brontë, was an Irish clergyman, stern, devoted, and often withdrawn. Their mother, Maria, died when the sisters were still very young, leaving them to grow up under the care of their aunt, Elizabeth Branwell. The family was large once, 6 children, but 2 of the eldest girls, Maria and Elizabeth, died at a cruelly early age, victims of disease and neglect at a harsh boarding school for clergymen's daughters. That school would later inspire Charlotte's depiction of Lowood Institution in Jane Eyre, a place of cold porridge, strict discipline, and the silent suffering of children too proud to complain. The loss of her sisters at such a young age left a mark on her that never faded. It shaped the way she viewed love, death, and injustice. In the years that followed, the surviving Brontë siblings, Charlotte, Emily, Anne, and their only brother Branwell, retreated inward, creating imaginary kingdoms to fill the silence. They called them Angria and Gondel, complex fantasy worlds born from scraps of paper and boundless imagination. These weren't simple childhood games. They were intricate universes filled with battles, kings, politics, and doomed lovers. Long before they were novelists, the Brontes were dreamers of entire civilizations. It was as though the Moors themselves had lent them their imagination, wild, unpredictable, and vast. Each sister had her own nature. Charlotte, the eldest, was practical and ambitious. Her writing carried structure and fire. She observed the world with sharp intelligence and deep emotion. Emily, the quietest, seemed to belong more to the wind and the heather than to people. She rarely spoke to strangers, preferring the company of her dog, Keeper, and the fierce solitude of the hills. Yet her heart held storms, and her pen poured them into Wuthering Heights, a novel that shocked Victorian England with its raw power. Anne, the youngest, was gentle and steady, yet her mind was no less bold. Her novels, Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, tackled subjects that few women dared to write about: abuse, addiction, and female independence. She was the quiet revolutionary among them, the one who understood suffering not as spectacle, but as truth. And then there was Branwell, their brother, whose promise was undone by his own demons. He, too, was a writer, an artist, once full of hope, but addiction and despair consumed him, and his decline would cast a long shadow over the household. His room, lit by the flicker of a candle, became a place of muffled footsteps and late-night sobs. Life in the parsonage was both routine and otherworldly. Mornings were filled with chores and their father's sermons. Evenings with reading aloud by the fire. The sisters would discuss poetry, their latest chapters, and sometimes their fears. When they were together, ideas flowed like wind through an open window. But behind their unity lay the constant presence of death and isolation, each loss drawing them closer together and deeper into their art. When they began to write seriously, they faced the barrier of their own time. Women writers were not taken seriously and could even be mocked for ambition. So, they chose to publish under male pseudonyms, Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Even their father didn't know at first. The three names would soon become famous, whispered in literary circles with both admiration and suspicion. Charlotte's Jane Eyre would be the first to capture attention. Its passionate defiance and haunting emotion made her an overnight sensation. But no one yet knew that Ellis Bell, the author of Wuthering Heights, was her own sister, Emily, a woman who rarely left her home. Behind these achievements, though, the sisters' health was already faltering. The damp air of the moors, their years of grief, and their overworked bodies began to take a toll. Yet they continued to write, driven by something beyond ambition. It was as if they were racing against time itself, pouring their souls onto paper before the silence claimed them too. In the flickering light of the parsonage, three sisters sat side by side, their lives braided together like the strands of an old, windswept tale. They could not have known that one day their names would stand among the greatest in English literature, or that the stories born from their small, lonely world would echo through centuries, stirring hearts and haunting imaginations. Their tragedy was not only in their deaths, but in the shortness of their time. Yet within those brief years, they captured something eternal, the wildness of human emotion, the hunger for freedom, and the fragile beauty of hope against despair. In the heart of the moors, where the wind never stops, you can still feel them, Charlotte's fiery will, Emily's fierce spirit, Anne's quiet strength, three voices carried forever on the breeze. Section 2. The Secret Book of Poems. It began quietly, like all things that matter most. Three sisters gathered around a single candle in the deep hush of an English night. The year was 1845, and the world outside their parsonage in Haworth was asleep under a veil of cold mist. But inside, the Brontë sisters were wide awake, their hearts filled with words that would not rest until they were written. The story of their poetry began long before that night. Since childhood, they had written verses to accompany their imaginary worlds, Gondel and Angria. But as the years passed and adulthood arrived, they began to write not of kings and empires, but of themselves, of longing, of grief, of hope trapped in a quiet life. Poetry became the language through which they breathed. Emily's poems were wild, shaped by the moors themselves. They carried the pulse of wind and rain, the defiance of lonely places. There was no softness in them, but a kind of sacred ferocity, like the earth speaking through her. Charlotte's poems, in contrast, were deeply human, full of yearning and observation, often touched by melancholy and reflection. Anne's verses were calm, thoughtful, and steeped in faith. She wrote of duty, compassion, and the quiet dignity of endurance. Yet none of these poems were ever meant to be shared. Each sister wrote in secret, hiding her notebooks away when footsteps came down the hall. For in their time, women were expected to embroider, not imagine, to pray, not publish. Even dreaming too vividly could be seen as dangerous. Then one day, quite by accident, the secret was uncovered. Charlotte, searching through Emily's desk, found a small, weathered notebook. Within it were verses unlike anything she had ever read. Raw, powerful, and filled with emotion so fierce that it seemed to burn through the paper. Shocked and moved, Charlotte brought it to her sister. Emily was furious. Her privacy had been invaded, her soul exposed. She had never meant for anyone, least of all her family, to read her poems. She withdrew, silent and trembling, as Charlotte tried to explain that her words were too beautiful, too extraordinary to remain hidden. That night was a turning point. What began as anger turned, slowly, into understanding. Charlotte spoke with a kind of urgency. She saw in those poems not just talent, but something divine. She knew that Emily's voice deserved to be heard beyond their small, wind-beaten home. And she insisted, so did Anne's and her own. In the weeks that followed, the sisters began to discuss the unthinkable, publishing a book of poetry. They worked in secret, sharing only with each other. By lamplight, they selected the best of their verses. Emily's haunting remembrance, Charlotte's evening solace, Anne's a word to the elect. Each poem was like a glimpse into their hearts, yet none of them could risk revealing their true names. The literary world of 19th century England was ruled by men. Women writers were often dismissed as sentimental, their words deemed suitable only for small domestic themes. To protect their work and perhaps their dignity, they decided to adopt pseudonyms. They became Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell. The initials preserved their bond: C for Charlotte, E for Emily, A for Anne. They chose names that were ambiguous, neither clearly male nor female, but strong and serious enough to command respect. It was a quiet rebellion, a way to step into the world without apology. Pooling what little money they had, they sent their manuscript to a small London publisher named Aylett and Jones. It was titled simply, Poems by Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell. The sisters waited. Weeks passed, then months. When the book finally appeared in 1846, it sold only a handful of copies, fewer than 10. Most of those they bought themselves. It would have been easy to give up, to believe the world had no place for their voices. But the sisters didn't write for fame. They wrote because they must, because their hearts would not let them stop. And even in its failure, that little book marked a beginning. It gave them courage to try something bolder, something that would shake the quiet world that ignored them. they turned their pens toward novels. But before that next chapter began, the sisters spent one more season together in the rhythm of the moors and the firelight. Their bond deepened. The rejection of their poems became a secret triumph, a test they had passed. They had entered the world of letters, even if no one yet knew their names. Charlotte would later write that Emily's talent was not of this world. She believed her sister's poetry touched something eternal, that she had glimpsed truths that words could barely contain. And indeed, Emily's verses, then and now, carry a strange music, like the echo of something ancient. Lines such as, "No coward soul is mine, no trembler in the world's storm-troubled sphere," seem to speak of a courage beyond time. The world outside Haworth remained indifferent to their efforts, but inside the parsonage, something had changed. Their secret had become their strength. They now knew that they could shape language as powerfully as any man in London. Each evening, after tending to the house, they would return to their writing desks. Charlotte's lamp glowed in one corner, Anne's soft pen scratches filled another, and Emily's window was often open to the wind. The air carried a strange energy, as if the moors themselves were leaning in to listen. None of them could have guessed that just a few years later, those same names, Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell, would become famous across England, or that their novels, born from heartbreak and fire, would change literature forever. But in that moment, in 1846, all they had was a thin book of poems, a fragile hope, and each other. They stood at the edge of greatness without knowing it, their lives still confined to the small gray parsonage and the endless horizon beyond. Sometimes history begins, not with an explosion of fame, but with a whisper, a quiet act of defiance, a book that almost no one read, a candle burning in the window of a house at the edge of the world. And so the three sisters kept writing, because somewhere deep inside, they already knew words could outlive sorrow. Section 3. The birth of the novels. After the quiet disappointment of their poetry collection, the Brontë sisters turned their eyes toward a new and more daring frontier, the novel. They had spent years observing life from the small windows of the Haworth parsonage, quietly collecting the details of human hearts. Now they began to weave those memories into stories that would one day shake the foundations of English literature. It began with Charlotte. While still teaching in Brussels, she had written fragments of stories, passionate, intelligent, sometimes despairing. But now, back in Haworth, surrounded by the restless wind of the moors, she resolved to write a novel that captured what it meant to live a hidden life of emotion and imagination. That novel would become The Professor. It told the story of an Englishman teaching abroad, a reflection of Charlotte's own experiences, her loneliness, her struggle to be seen and respected. But though the writing was beautiful and sincere, the publishers rejected it again and again. And yet, rejection never silenced her. While she sent out The Professor, she began another work, a story about a poor, plain, fiercely independent young woman who refused to accept the limits the world set for her. This woman, born in the quiet of Charlotte's imagination, would soon become Jane Eyre. Meanwhile, Emily was writing too, but in secret as always. Her mind worked differently from her sister's. She didn't study people, she felt them. Her world was not of society and manners, but of storms and spirits. In her solitude, she began to write a story unlike any other, Wuthering Heights. It was dark, fierce, and utterly untamed. The characters did not behave as readers expected. They loved wildly, they hated completely, and they defied the moral order of Victorian England. It was a book born from the moors themselves. Strange, brutal, and breathtaking. Anne, the youngest, had her own story to tell. Her time as a governess had left her with quiet but unshakable memories of injustice. The way the poor were treated, the arrogance of wealth, the loneliness of women working in silence. Her first novel, Agnes Grey, was a gentle but piercing reflection of that life. And so, in the small, dimly lit rooms of their home, 3 novels began to take form. 3 women writing at night, surrounded by silence, the ticking of a clock, the occasional cry of wind through the chimney, the scratch of a pen. It's almost impossible to imagine the energy in that little house. Each sister burning with her own vision of the world, each creating something that had never existed before. They did not write for money or fame. They wrote because their inner worlds demanded it, because to not write would have been to suffocate. When the time came to send their manuscripts into the world, they again used their pseudonyms, Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Their gender remained a secret, their identities hidden even from their publishers. In 1847, Jane Eyre was published first, and unlike the poetry collection, this time the world noticed. Readers were struck by its voice, passionate, intelligent, and unflinchingly honest. Here was a heroine who spoke her mind, who dared to love, who valued her dignity over her safety. Charlotte had created not a fantasy, but a mirror, one that reflected what so many women of her time had long felt, but could not say. Within months, Jane Eyre was a sensation. Critics called it powerful, shocking, even revolutionary, and yet they could not quite decide what to make of Currer Bell. Was this bold author a man or a woman? As Jane Eyre captured hearts across England, Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey were quietly released as a joint volume later that same year. But the reaction to them could not have been more different. Readers didn't know what to do with Wuthering Heights. It was too wild, too dark, too raw. Many critics called it savage and disordered. They could not see what Emily had created, a story about the eternal cycle of love and revenge, about the haunting of the human soul. Anne's Agnes Grey, though more conventional, struck a quiet chord with those who read it carefully. Beneath its calm tone, it carried a strong moral backbone, a subtle protest against cruelty and hypocrisy. Inside the parsonage, the sisters read the reviews together. Emily shrugged off the criticism. She did not write to please anyone. "I wish to be as God made me," she once said, "not one atom different." Anne remained gentle, patient, her faith guiding her through the noise. Charlotte, ever the leader, felt both triumph and sorrow, her success shadowed by the world's misunderstanding of her sister's genius. The 3 novels, so different in voice and spirit, reflected 3 souls bound by blood and art. Charlotte's world was one of conscience and will, Emily's of passion and nature, Anne's of truth and moral clarity. Together, They formed a kind of literary constellation, three lights in the storm. As winter deepened over Haworth, the sisters continued to write, still under their pseudonyms, their identities still hidden. They were aware that the world outside was beginning to whisper about the mysterious bells. Were they brothers, cousins, reclusive scholars? None of it mattered to them. What mattered was that their words had crossed into the world, alive, printed, real. The moors might still surround them, but their voices now traveled far beyond them. In that moment, they did not yet know how short their time together would be. They did not know how fame would come hand in hand with tragedy. They only knew that their stories, born in silence and struggle, had finally been heard. And somewhere between the wind and the ink, the impossible had happened. Three women, hidden in a small parsonage on the edge of the world, had changed the course of English literature forever. Section 4. The Mystery of the Bell Brothers. Fame, Rumors, and Revelation. The year was 1848, and the wind that swept across the Yorkshire moors seemed to carry whispers with it. Whispers of three mysterious authors who had taken the literary world by storm. Their names, Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell, were on the tongues of critics, readers, and publishers alike. But no one knew who they were. The mystery only deepened as Jane Eyre continued to sell in astonishing numbers. Wuthering Heights bewildered and fascinated readers in equal measure, and Agnes Grey quietly gained admiration for its moral precision. Who were these Bells? Were they scholars hidden in some quiet university? Were they men of the cloth, philosophers perhaps? Or were they, as some dared to speculate, women? In an age when women were expected to write only about domestic sweetness, the Bells' novels seemed far too powerful, too unsettling. Their voices carried the kind of authority rarely granted to female pens. Publishers wrote cautious letters, journalists speculated in print, and readers debated in drawing rooms. If these are women, one critic wrote, then they must be women of a most extraordinary kind. Back at the parsonage, the Brontë sisters followed all of this with quiet amusement and growing tension. The truth that three young women from an obscure Yorkshire village had shaken the English literary world felt almost too fragile to reveal. Emily, as always, had no interest in society's curiosity. She would not play their game. Anne, gentle and truthful, believed honesty was best, but she followed Charlotte's lead. And Charlotte, bold, perceptive, always half torn between humility and ambition, felt a mix of pride and fear. It was she who kept up the correspondence with their publisher, George Smith, who admired the mysterious Currer Bell, but could not quite imagine who he or she might be. For a time, their secret held. They continued writing, each lost in her own world. Emily was quietly shaping her poems. Anne was at work on her next novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and Charlotte began to plan new stories as letters from publishers poured in. But as fame spread, so too did confusion. A London newspaper mistakenly attributed Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey to Currer Bell, assuming all three novels were written by one brilliant mind. Others speculated that Kerr, Ellis, and Acton were three pseudonyms for the same author. To the sisters, who valued honesty even under disguise, this was unbearable. They could not let Emily's and Anne's work be erased by mistake, and so Charlotte decided they must go to London in secret. It was the summer of 1848, when Charlotte and Anne, dressed plainly and carrying little more than a change of clothes and their letters from the publishers, left Haworth for the first time in many years. Emily refused to join them. "What should I do there?" she asked. "My place is here." Their journey was filled with quiet anxiety. Two small figures traveling through the vastness of England, hearts pounding with the weight of their secret. When they arrived in London, they went straight to the offices of Smith, Elder & Co. Charlotte asked to see George Smith himself. When he entered, expecting perhaps two country gentlemen, he instead found two pale, modest women standing nervously before him. Charlotte stepped forward and said simply, "We are Kerr and Acton Bell." For a long moment, Smith was silent. Then he smiled in astonishment. "I can scarcely believe it," he said. "Two ladies from Yorkshire." The revelation changed everything, and yet for Charlotte and Anne it changed nothing. They remained who they had always been, quiet, devoted, driven by imagination rather than fame. But outside the parsonage, the truth created a storm. Word began to spread that the mysterious Bells were women, and not only women, but sisters. Some readers were delighted, others scandalized. "It is impossible," wrote one critic, "that such force and passion could come from a female hand." And yet, as the gossip swirled, the Brontes themselves returned home to the moors, to the stillness that had always been their true world. They had tasted the outside world briefly, and found it noisy, confusing, filled with judgment. Back at Haworth, Emily sat by the window, the wind tossing her hair, the moors stretching endlessly beyond. Charlotte told her what had happened, how the publishers had reacted, how astonished they had been. Emily only smiled faintly. "They may call us what they please," she said. "It will not make us better or worse." That autumn, the sisters returned to their writing, their secret now open, but their lives still cloaked in solitude. And yet, just as fame reached them, tragedy came too. The same year that had seen their names known across England also brought sickness to the parsonage. Their brother Branwell, long struggling with addiction and despair, grew weaker by the day. His dreams of being a great artist had dissolved into smoke. The sisters cared for him as best they could, even as he became increasingly fragile, his body and mind consumed by his inner torments. He died in September 1848, at the age of 31. Emily, closest to him in spirit, was struck deeply. She grew pale and silent, but refused any doctor's help. "I will not yield to illness," she said. Within 3 months, she too was gone, her body defeated by tuberculosis, her soul as fierce as ever to the end. Anne followed only a few months later, her gentle spirit fading quietly beside the sea at Scarborough. By the time a full year had passed, Charlotte was the only Brontë sister left. From the mystery of the Bell brothers to the heartbreak of loss, the story of the Brontes had turned from triumph to tragedy almost overnight. But even in their grief, their words endured, echoing across time, alive with passion, courage, and truth. Section 5. Charlotte Alone, the last voice of the Brontes. The parsonage at Haworth had always been quiet, but after the deaths of Emily and Anne, that silence became unbearable. an echo of lives once full of whispers, laughter, and the scratching of pens on paper. Charlotte walked the halls alone now, her footsteps soft on the worn stone floors. Every room carried the ghost of memory. The chair where Emily had sat, lost in thought. Anne's small desk by the window where she would write patiently in the morning light. Branwell's sketches still scattered in a drawer, faint reminders of his lost dreams. Outside, the moors stretched endlessly, dark, untamed, and windswept. The same landscape that had given birth to their stories. But now to Charlotte, it felt like a vast graveyard of all she had loved. Still, she could not stop writing. It was not only her gift, it was her way to survive. In 1849, she poured her heart into a new novel, Shirley. This time, her characters were drawn from life. The struggles of Yorkshire's working people, the solitude of intelligent women in a world that misunderstood them, and the ache of living after so much loss. As she wrote, she confessed in a letter to her publisher, George Smith, "I have written because I must. I have tried to grasp something of peace in this work, but peace comes not to me." When Shirley was published, readers sensed its melancholy and its power. Critics praised it, yet they also noticed the shadow that lingered in its pages, the shadow of grief. Charlotte began to emerge from her seclusion, encouraged by Smith to visit London again. There, she was no longer an anonymous bell-brother, but Miss Brontë, the famed author of Jane Eyre. At first, she felt like a traveler from another world. The bustling city overwhelmed her. Its crowds, its glittering parties, its fashionable people. She was shy and soft-spoken, more comfortable with books than with conversation. Yet, in the midst of this strange new life, something unexpected happened. She began to form friendships with writers such as Elizabeth Gaskell, who saw through Charlotte's reserve and recognized her depth of feeling. At literary gatherings, Charlotte would sit quietly at first, her small figure hardly noticed, until she spoke, and her words, though few, carried such intensity that rooms would fall silent to hear her. Yet even as she was celebrated, she remained a woman apart. The literary world could not quite understand her, nor could she ever forget that her fame had come at the cost of those she had loved. When admirers spoke of Emily's Wuthering Heights or Anne's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Charlotte's heart ached with pride and sorrow. She defended their names fiercely when critics called their work coarse or unfeminine. No one who knew them could speak so, she once wrote. They were noble, pure, and true, as the sunlight on the moors. Years passed, and though her health was never strong, Charlotte continued to write. In 1853, she published Villette, a haunting story of loneliness, faith, and suppressed passion. Many consider it her most personal work, for within its heroine, Lucy Snow, Charlotte revealed the deepest parts of herself, her longing for connection, her struggle between reason and feeling, and her quiet endurance. The book was a success, but its tone was somber. It reflected the woman she had become, wiser, more self-aware, but still shadowed by loss. During these years, life began to change again in quiet, unexpected ways. Her father, old and nearly blind, still preached at the parish, and the house, though empty of her siblings,
remained full of memory and duty. Visitors sometimes came, admirers of her novels,
curious about the authoress of Jane Eyre. She received them politely, though never comfortably. But one visitor came more often, a man she had long known, Arthur Bell Nichols, her father's curate. For years he had served under her father, a quiet, devout man of Irish descent. Charlotte had once thought little of him, even describing him as dull. But as time passed, she began to see something in him, a steady kindness, a loyalty that did not waver even when she ignored or rebunked him. When he finally confessed his feelings, she was taken aback. At first, she refused him, fearing her father's disapproval, fearing perhaps even her own heart. But Nichols did not give up. His affection was patient, his care sincere, and in the stillness of Haworth, after years of solitude, Charlotte realized she no longer wanted to live only in memory. In 1854, she married him. Their marriage was quiet, humble, and deeply tender. For the first time in years, Charlotte allowed herself to feel happiness, to imagine a life not defined by loss. She walked with Arthur through the moors, now softer in her eyes. She wrote to her friends of her newfound peace, saying simply, "He is kind and good. I have found a home again." Yet fate, as always, had its own plan. Within a year, Charlotte's health began to fail. In early 1855, she fell gravely ill, perhaps from complications of pregnancy, perhaps from exhaustion. Arthur never left her side. Her last letters spoke of gratitude, of quiet acceptance. On March 31st, 1855, Charlotte Brontë died. She was 38 years old. She was buried beside her sisters, beneath the same gray stones of Haworth Church, where the moors whisper still. Charlotte's death marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in English literature, a story of three sisters who, from a lonely parsonage on the edge of the world, changed forever what the written word could be. Their voices, fierce, tender, defiant, still echo through time, unbroken by death. For even when the world fell silent around them, they continued to speak through their art, and through the hearts of those who still listen. Section 6. After the Brontes, Legacy, Memory, and the Echo of the Moors. When the last candle in the parsonage was snuffed out, Haworth became a quieter place than ever before. The wind still roamed freely across the hills, rattling the chapel windows and bending the dark grass on the moor. But the voices that once filled those walls were gone. For years after Charlotte's death, her father, Patrick Brontë, lived on in solitude. He was an old man by then, nearly blind, carrying the weight of all he had lost, his wife, his son, his 3 daughters. The house was now tended by silent housekeepers, but every room still seemed to hold its former inhabitants. Faint laughter caught in the corners, whispers that time could not quite erase. Visitors came sometimes, drawn by curiosity or reverence. They would walk softly through the small, neat rooms, imagining the 3 sisters bent over their writing tables, dreaming of worlds far grander than the one that surrounded them. They might see Emily's small piano, still standing near the parlor window, or Anne's books, their pages yellowing but cherished. And outside, the vast landscape that had inspired Wuthering Heights stretched endlessly, unchanged, eternal. It was Elizabeth Gaskell, Charlotte's dear friend, who first sought to preserve their story. In 1857, she published The Life of Charlotte Brontë, a biography that would introduce the world to the women behind the novels. But her book was not just biography, it was devotion. Through her words, the Brontës were no longer only mysterious names on the title pages of Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. They became human, sisters of flesh and spirit who had struggled, loved, and suffered together. Gaskell described their isolation, the hard Yorkshire winters, the stern father, the loss that shadowed their lives. Readers who had once imagined the Bell brothers as confident men of letters now wept to learn that they were, in truth, quiet, shy women who had fought to have their voices heard in a world that had little room for them. After the book's release, the Brontë parsonage became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People traveled from all corners of England to see where Jane Eyre had been written, to walk where Emily had wandered, to stand on the moors and feel the same wild wind that had stirred her imagination. But time moved on, as it always does. The Victorian world that had once ignored the Brontës' genius began to revere them. By the early 20th century, their novels were studied, quoted, and loved by readers across continents. And yet, in a strange way, their fame only deepened the mystery. How could three women, living in such obscurity, create works of such fierce originality and passion? How had they, from a small parsonage in Yorkshire, reached into the soul of humanity and written stories that still speak to us today? The answer, perhaps, lies not only in their talent, but in their isolation. They lived close to the bone of life, where love, death, hope, and despair were not abstractions, but daily realities. They understood solitude not as emptiness, but as space, space to dream, to imagine, to feel deeply. Every storm that swept over the moors, every candle flicker in the night, every church bell tolling for another lost soul, these were the rhythms of their art. Even after their deaths, the house at Haworth seemed to keep that rhythm alive. Visitors described the uncanny stillness as if the air itself remembered. The wooden floors creaked softly, as though someone had just left the room. Sometimes, late in the evening, locals claimed they saw a faint light in the upper window, perhaps only a trick of reflection. Or perhaps, as some whispered, one of the sisters still at her desk, writing. In the decades that followed, the Brontë Parsonage Museum was established, preserving their home almost exactly as it had been. Charlotte's writing table, her tiny spectacles, Emily's inkstand, all remain in their places, touched by time but not erased by it. Even today, those who visit speak of a strange, quiet emotion that fills the rooms. It is not sorrow, exactly, but something gentler. The feeling of standing where genius once bloomed in silence. Out on the moors, the wind still moves through the heather, carrying with it the same low hum that inspired Wuthering Heights. In spring, the wildflowers bloom in soft waves of purple and gold, and in winter, the landscape turns gray and solemn, as if wearing mourning for the women who once walked its paths. The Brontes' legacy endures not only because of their words, but because of what those words came from. They wrote of love that defied class and reason, of spirits that could not rest, of women who refused to be tamed by the world around them. Their stories are, at their core, about the strength of the soul, about finding one's voice even when the world refuses to listen. And so, even now, more than a century later, the name Brontë carries with it a sense of mystery and longing. Their novels are read and reimagined, their characters still alive in countless adaptations, their ideas still stirring the hearts of dreamers and outsiders everywhere. But perhaps their greatest achievement is this, that they remind us what it means to feel deeply, to create in solitude, and to turn even pain into beauty. The wind that sweeps over the moors tonight is the same one that once brushed against Emily's cheek. The rain that falls on the parsonage roof is the same that Charlotte heard as she wrote Jane Eyre by candlelight. And though the sisters are long gone, the world they built, fierce, fragile, unforgettable, still lives in every reader who turns their pages and listens, for a moment, to the echoes of the moors. Section 7. The Hidden World of the Brontes' Juvenilia. The Kingdoms of Glasstown and Angria. Long before the Brontë sisters became names known across the world, they were children in the small, gray parsonage at Haworth, lonely, brilliant, and endlessly imaginative. Their world outside was narrow, the churchyard, the moor, the village school. But inside, within the quiet walls of their home, they built a universe vast enough to hold their dreams. It began one rainy afternoon in 1826 when their father, Patrick Brontë, brought home a set of 12 wooden toy soldiers for Branwell, the only son of the family. To most children, such figures would have been mere playthings, but for the Brontes, they became the seeds of entire worlds. Each child claimed one soldier and gave it a name. They became generals, kings, and heroes. They built cities for them out of paper, drew maps of imaginary continents, and wrote stories of their adventures. What began as a simple game grew, year by year, into a living mythology that would shape the very foundations of their writing. Charlotte and Branwell created Glasstown, a shimmering city-state set on the coast of Africa, a place of politics, romance, and intrigue. It was a reflection of the world they glimpsed through newspapers and their father's books. The British Empire, colonial wars, great generals, and poets. But in their hands, those distant echoes of the adult world became something else, a landscape of their own design, alive with imagination and rebellion. The children filled tiny notebooks with their stories, written in script so small that it could barely be read without a magnifying glass. They did this to keep their secret world safe, private from the eyes of grown-ups who might not understand. In those miniature volumes, they chronicled decades of history, crafted political alliances, and invented entire civilizations. Glasstown soon expanded into new territories. Angria, ruled by passionate, flawed heroes and haunted by deep emotions, that even the young Brontes could not yet name. Later, Emily and Anne would split off from Charlotte and Branwell's sprawling world to create one of their own, the Kingdom of Gondel, set among wild northern landscapes filled with doomed love and vengeance. These were not childish scribbles, but the early sparks of literary genius. Charlotte's Angria stories already carried the seeds of Jane Eyre, proud heroines, dark castles, and brooding men with hidden hearts. Emily's Gondel poems foretold the fierce storms and ghostly longings that would one day shape Wuthering Heights. Anne's quiet moral clarity, her focus on truth, conscience, and endurance, was already visible in her writings, a glimpse of the voice that would later speak so clearly in Agnes Grey and the tenant of Wildfell Hall. In these imagined kingdoms, the Brontë children explored everything the real world denied them. They ruled over empires, commanded armies, fell in love, and suffered heartbreak. They gave themselves freedom, the power to feel and to create without restraint. There is something profoundly moving about this secret creativity. The parsonage stood on the edge of a graveyard, surrounded by endless sky and stone, yet within it burned a light so strong it illuminated entire continents of make-believe. By candlelight, with scraps of paper and ink, the Brontes built their own cosmos, one more vivid, more alive than the quiet world they inhabited by day. They did not write for an audience. There were no publishers to please, no readers to impress. They wrote for the joy of it, for the pure thrill of bringing imagination to life. And in doing so, they forged their identities as writers long before the world would ever know their names. When you read fragments of their juvenilia today, the faint, nearly microscopic handwriting, the grand names of kings and generals, the bursts of poetic intensity, it feels like opening a time capsule of genius. You can see the formation of their style. Charlotte's controlled fire, Emily's raw intensity, Anne's quiet strength. You can also feel their hunger, the yearning to reach beyond the confines of their small world. It's strange to think that without these early, secret stories, the Brontes might never have become who they were. Glasstown and Angria were not merely games. They were training grounds for greatness. Through them, the sisters learned how to build complex worlds, how to craft emotion through words, how to turn loneliness into creation, and perhaps most beautifully, they learned how to share a dream, even as adults. When their lives grew harder and their families smaller, the memory of those childhood kingdoms never faded. It was the one place where they had been together, all four of them, bound not by loss or grief, but by imagination. In a way, those invented worlds were their first act of defiance. They said, "We may be small, we may be unseen, but our minds can shape entire universes." And so they did. Today, the tiny manuscripts of Glasstown and Angria rest behind glass in the Brontë Parsonage Museum. They are barely larger than a matchbox, delicate, nearly weightless, and yet within them lies the weight of entire worlds. The ink has faded, the pages are fragile, but their energy still hums, alive with the same electric curiosity that once filled the minds of four extraordinary children. Standing before them, you might imagine the young Brontes gathered at their table, the candle burning low,
the wind howling outside, whispering to each other as they write, their voices soft but sure. The ghosts of their imaginary kingdoms live on in every line they ever wrote afterward, a reminder that even the smallest beginnings can hold infinite possibility. For within the imagination of those four children was not just the spark of fiction, but the flame of something timeless, the belief that words, however small, can create worlds that never die.
Section 8. Love, Loss, and Letters. The human hearts behind the legends. Behind every word the Brontë sisters wrote was a heart that had endured far more than its share of sorrow. Their lives were not simply literary triumphs, they were emotional odysseys, shaped by love, longing, and a loneliness that left its quiet mark on every page. To understand their stories, one must first step into the intimate world of their hearts, where unspoken affection and restrained desire flowed not through embraces, but through ink. In the 19th century, love was rarely simple, especially for women. The Brontës lived in a world that prized obedience and modesty, where passion was seen as dangerous and independence could be mistaken for rebellion. Yet in the privacy of their letters and the secret folds of their fiction, each sister revealed the deepest truths of the human soul. Charlotte, the eldest surviving sister, felt this more keenly than anyone. She was intensely emotional, her mind alight with thought, her heart restless and yearning. When she worked as a governess in Brussels in 1842, she met Constantine Hager, the married professor who ran the school where she and Emily taught. He was kind, intelligent, and deeply engaged with literature, the very qualities that could stir the soul of someone like Charlotte. Her feelings for him became a quiet torment, one that grew into a deep and painful love. For the rest of her life, Charlotte would remember him. In the letters she wrote after leaving Brussels, her affection is raw and unguarded. Letters she begged him to destroy, though he did not. They are among the most haunting pieces of writing in English literature, their language trembling with honesty. "I cannot," she wrote, "I will not resign myself to the total loss of my master's friendship." Each word seemed to bleed. It is easy to imagine her sitting at her small desk in Haworth, candlelight flickering, her pen scratching across the page, knowing full well that what she was writing could never bring him back. This ache of unfulfilled love became the pulse of Jane Eyre, her masterpiece. In Jane's yearning for Mr. Rochester, we hear Charlotte's own heart, its courage, its hunger for respect, and its refusal to settle for a love that diminishes the soul. Jane's defiant cry, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me," was Charlotte's own declaration of independence, a vow to love deeply but never lose herself in the process. Emily's story of love was of a different nature. Her heart did not turn outward, but inward, toward the vast wildness of her own spirit. There is no evidence that Emily ever loved anyone in a romantic sense, yet her understanding of love was perhaps the most profound of all. In Wuthering Heights, she gave the world one of the most unsettling portrayals of passion ever written. Love as an elemental force, wild and consuming, a union of souls that defies even death. When Catherine cries, "I am Heathcliff," it is not the voice of a woman speaking to a man, but of one spirit recognizing itself in another. Emily's love was the kind that transcends the body, the kind that belongs to the soul of the universe. Those who knew her spoke of her intensity, her silence, her otherworldliness. She rarely spoke of feelings, but her poetry burned with them. Love is like the wild rose briar, she wrote, friendship like the holly tree. In her verses, love is both beauty and pain, a flame that warms and scars. Her solitude was not emptiness, it was communion with something vast, something beyond words. Anne, the youngest, understood love as both sacred and moral. Her experience was tempered by observation, the quiet witness of the governess who saw how society's rules could corrupt the human heart. Her novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, was a cry for truth in a world that often preferred silence. In Helen Huntington, Anne created a heroine of remarkable strength, a woman who leaves her husband to protect her child and her dignity, defying every social law of her time. It was not a romantic fantasy, but a statement of principle, that love without respect is not love at all. Anne's view of love was clear-eyed and courageous. It was about endurance, faith, and the quiet triumph of conscience. For all three sisters, love was not simply a feeling. It was a moral, spiritual, and artistic question. It asked, what does it mean to give yourself without losing yourself? To be free and yet bound by devotion. Their answers, though different, all led to the same truth. Love is never weakness. It is strength, though it often hurts. The Brontes' letters remain among their most revealing works. Through them, we hear their real voices, tender, witty, melancholic, and full of longing. Charlotte's letters pulse with life, her thoughts leaping from books to friendship to grief. Anne's are gentle and reflective, full of concern for others. Emily's are rare and sparse, yet in their absence, she speaks louder than most. It is as if her silence itself was a form of poetry. What is most striking about their correspondence is not simply what they said, but what they withheld. In an age when women were not encouraged to speak freely, they poured their truth into the only space where they could be both honest and unseen, the written word. Their letters became their refuge, their mirror, their way of existing beyond the small world that confined them. It is easy, in our age of endless communication, to forget how precious a single letter once was, how each page was folded carefully, sealed with wax, and sent into the unknown, carrying the essence of a heart across miles. When the Brontes wrote, they were not just expressing, they were connecting. And in that quiet act of connection, they found a form of immortality. Their love stories were not only about romance, but about humanity, how deeply we can feel, how courageously we can endure, and how beautifully we can translate the ache of life into art. Each sister, in her own way, transformed longing into literature. And through that transformation, they became eternal. Their words remind us that even when love cannot be spoken aloud, it can still echo across centuries. That sometimes the most powerful bonds are the ones that live, not in touch, but in thought, in the tender silence between hearts that understand. And so, when we read their works today, it is not only their characters we meet, but the women themselves, Charlotte, Emily, Anne. Three hearts still beating softly through time, still whispering their truth through the fragile music of their words. Section 9. The Shadow of Branwell, the brother who fell from grace. Every bright flame casts a shadow, and for the Brontë family, that shadow was their only brother, Branwell Brontë. He was the promise that once shone so brightly in their childhood world, the brother whose dreams seemed boundless, whose imagination burned as fiercely as his sister's. And yet his story is a tragedy that echoes softly through the pages of their lives. A reminder of how easily brilliance can turn to despair. From the earliest days in Haworth Parsonage, Branwell was the center of the little world the siblings built together. Their childhood was not one of toys and playmates, but of imagination. They created entire kingdoms out of ink and scraps of paper. The Glasstown Confederacy, later evolving into Angria and Gondal. In these vast imaginary empires, Branwell was often the leader, inventing rulers, wars, and intrigues with the fierce intelligence of a born storyteller. The sisters followed his lead, penning tales that reflected the same bold spirit. He was their hero, their playmate, their guide. But as childhood faded into adulthood, the magic began to break apart. The world outside Haworth demanded more practical things: work, income, discipline, and it was here that Branwell began to falter. While his sisters quietly turned to teaching and writing, he dreamed of greatness. He wanted to be a painter, a poet, an intellectual admired by London society. He was talented. His portraits, though few, reveal a genuine artistic gift. Yet his ambition far outstripped his patience. For Branwell, success needed to be swift and glittering, not slow and earned. When he left home to study art in London, the city's noise and promise overwhelmed him. He spent more time in taverns than at his easel. His letters home filled with excuses and plans that never quite took shape. He drifted through dreams of fame that always seemed just beyond his reach. And when those dreams failed to materialize, something in him began to break. Returning to Haworth in disappointment, Branwell's confidence turned to restlessness. He tried again, as a railway clerk, as a tutor, but his demons always followed. It was during his time as a tutor for the Robinson family that the most destructive chapter of his life began. He fell in love with Mrs. Lydia Robinson, his employer's wife, a woman older, married, and far beyond his reach. Whether their affair was real or imagined remains one of literary history's quieter mysteries. But for Branwell, the love was consuming, absolute, and ultimately ruinous. When he was dismissed from the Robinson household, he returned home a broken man. The rejection, the humiliation, and the weight of wasted potential began to crush him. He turned increasingly to alcohol and laudanum, the opium-based medicine that dulled both pain and thought. The same imagination that once created kingdoms now built prisons within his mind. And yet, even in his decline, flashes of genius remained. He wrote passionate, tortured poetry that spoke of love lost and redemption unattainable, words that burned with sincerity, if not with structure. The sisters watched helplessly as the brother who had once led them into the world of imagination descended into despair. Charlotte described his presence in the parsonage as both heartbreaking and terrifying. His nights were filled with drunken outbursts,
his health deteriorating, his spirit collapsing under the weight of guilt and dependency. Patrick Brontë, their father, did what he could, but there are limits to love when the one you're saving does not wish to be saved. And yet, despite his decline, the sisters' compassion never truly left him. Charlotte saw in Branwell's suffering a reflection of human frailty, and it deepened her understanding of the world's cruelty. Emily's silence became her strength. She endured his outbursts with a stoic calm, refusing to speak harshly of him. And the gentlest of the three loved him to the end. Her novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, is widely believed to have been inspired by Branwell, a raw portrayal of addiction, despair, and the ruin it brings upon a family. Through her writing, she turned his tragedy into a moral warning and an act of quiet empathy. By 1848, Branwell's body had begun to fail him. He was only 31 when death came, but his years had been heavy. Consumption, tuberculosis, was the final cause. Yet it was the sorrow and self-destruction that truly ended him. In the months before his death, he was said to have grown calm, almost repentant. He spoke softly of faith, of the sisters who had never abandoned him, and of the strange peace that comes when a storm finally breaks. He died standing, supported by his father's arms, as if refusing even in death to surrender completely. His death marked the beginning of the end for the Brontës. Within a year, Emily and Anne would follow, both succumbing to the same illness. But Branwell's passing had already changed something within the family. The air of Haworth seemed heavier, the light dimmer. Charlotte later wrote that even in his weakness, he had been part of the house's living soul. When he was gone, the silence was unbearable. In many ways, Branwell was a tragic mirror of what might have been. He possessed the same brilliance as his sisters, but lacked their discipline. He had their imagination, but not their endurance. While the sisters built worlds from pain, he was consumed by his own. His story reminds us that genius and self-destruction often walk side by side, divided only by the thinnest thread of strength. And yet, to think of Branwell only as a failure would be to miss the tenderness of his legacy. Without him, the imaginary worlds of their childhood might never have been born. Without his bold dreams, the sisters might not have found their voices so young. In his light and in his darkness, he shaped them. His life became both a caution and a catalyst, the tragic heartbeat beneath their collective genius. Today, when we look at the faded portrait he painted of his three sisters, his own figure later erased from the canvas, we see the ghost of a man who wanted to belong, who wanted to matter, and who in his own sad way still does. His story is not simply one of loss, but of love that lingered too fiercely in a fragile soul. Branwell Bronté's life may have ended in shadows, but those shadows gave the world a deeper light. The art of his sisters, the empathy in their characters, and the haunting reminder that even broken dreams can illuminate the human heart. Section 10. Emily's Quiet Rebellion, the Wild Genius of Wuthering Heights. If Branwell was the family's fallen star, Emily Brontë was its quiet flame,
one that burned not outwardly in public brilliance, but deep and steady, illuminating from within. To the outside world, she was reserved, even severe. To those who knew her best, she was a storm contained in stillness, fierce, loyal, and wild-hearted. And in her solitude, she created one of the most extraordinary novels ever written, Wuthering Heights. The world has rarely seen a book like it, before or since. It was written by a young woman who had never traveled beyond the Yorkshire moors, who shunned company, and who found the truest language of her soul in the wind that swept over the heath. Yet Wuthering Heights feels boundless, a vast, unsettling landscape of passion, revenge, and elemental emotion. To understand the novel is to understand Emily herself, her rebellion, her defiance, and her unique communion with nature. Emily Brontë lived largely in silence. Her world was the parsonage, the moor, and the endless sky. Unlike Charlotte, who sought to engage with the literary world, or Anne, who quietly studied human virtue and frailty, Emily belonged to something older, more primal. She was part of the land itself. Neighbors spoke of seeing her stride across the moors, alone. Her long dress whipping in the wind, her hair unpinned, her face pale but alive with a strange serenity. While others feared the wilderness, she found in it companionship. The moor was her confidant, her teacher, and her muse. It was in this solitude that Wuthering Heights was born, a novel unlike anything her contemporaries could comprehend. When it was published in 1847 under the pseudonym Ellis Bell, critics were scandalized. They called it coarse, savage, and unnatural. Its characters, Heathcliff and Catherine, bound by a love that defied morality and reason, frightened them. They were too real, too raw, too far from the polite boundaries of Victorian fiction. Yet beneath that wildness, the novel carried something sacred, a truth about love, pain, and human nature that few dared to speak aloud. Emily did not write to please. She wrote to express something vast and wordless, something that pulsed beneath her skin. Her rebellion was quiet but absolute. While society dictated that women write about gentle hearts and moral lessons, she wrote of storms, ghosts, and souls that refused to rest. Her characters were not virtuous, they were elemental. Heathcliff was not a hero, but a force, the embodiment of obsession, vengeance, and eternal longing. Catherine was not a saint, but a spirit torn between two worlds, one of duty, one of desire. Emily's art mirrored the rhythm of the moor, wild, eternal, indifferent to judgment. She once wrote, "I'll walk where my own nature would be leading." And she did. Every line of Wuthering Heights is a step on that untamed path, the mark of a woman who refused to bow to expectation, who dared to let her truth exist unsoftened. Within the parsonage, the novel's creation must have seemed both a marvel and a mystery. Charlotte admired her sister's genius, but could not fully grasp it. Anne respected her courage, but trembled at the story's darkness. Emily never defended herself. When criticism came, she remained silent, unmoved. For her, writing was not performance, it was necessity. She wrote as she breathed, as she walked, as she dreamed. The act itself was private, sacred. When Charlotte later tried to edit and republish Wuthering Heights, softening some of its wilder edges, she confessed that even she could not fully understand its origin, as if the book had sprung from some secret well that only Emily could reach. What made Wuthering Heights so powerful was not just its story, but its spirit. It was a novel about boundaries breaking between love and hatred, life and death, the human and the natural. Emily seemed to see existence as a single, eternal circle. When Catherine says, "I am Heathcliff," it is not mere romanticism. It is the expression of unity, of being inseparable from the other, from the world itself. That philosophy, mystical, almost pantheistic, shaped everything Emily did. She believed that souls did not vanish but transformed, blending into wind, soil, sky. In her poetry, she wrote of this often, of immortality not as heaven, but as continuation, as the persistence of being. Despite her fierce independence, Emily was deeply connected to her family. She nursed Branwell through his final days, bearing his moods and his pain in silence. She wrote by his bedside, sometimes listening to his fevered murmurs while shaping her own dark tales. When he died, she did not weep publicly. Instead, she walked alone to the moor, letting the wind carry her grief. That same winter, her health began to falter. Tuberculosis crept into her lungs, yet she refused all medicine, rejecting doctors and rest alike. Her will was unbending. She would not be made weak, not even by death. In her final days, she sat by the parsonage fire, her small dog Keeper pressed against her side. Her sisters begged her to lie down, but Emily whispered only, "I will not." Even as her strength left her, she clung to her independence with quiet dignity. When death came, it came suddenly, like a candle snuffed out by the wind she had so loved. She was 30 years old. After her death, Wuthering Heights began to change in the world's eyes. What critics had once scorned, later generations came to revere. Readers began to see its wild beauty, its fearless portrayal of passion and grief, its refusal to conform. Emily had written not for her time, but for all time. Her novel, like the moors themselves, endures, vast, haunting, eternal. Even today, when one reads her words, it feels as though she is still there, somewhere in the wind, watching from the heather-covered hills, unafraid and unbroken. Her rebellion was never loud. It was pure, serene, and complete. Through Wuthering Heights, Emily Brontë achieved what few ever do. She wrote a piece of the human soul itself, raw, untamed, and everlasting. Section 11. Anne Brontë, the quiet radical. While Emily roamed the moors and Charlotte charted the skies of ambition, Anne Brontë quietly carved her own path, one that demanded courage not with tempestuous storms, but with gentle, unyielding moral force. The youngest of the Brontë sisters, Anne was often overlooked in her lifetime, her brilliance measured only in whispers. Yet it was Anne who confronted the strictures of her society with a subtle but piercing clarity, revealing the injustices and hypocrisies of the world around her, and doing so in a voice that was entirely her own. Anne's world was small, yet her vision was extraordinary. She observed the lives of those around her, the servants, the laborers, the poor, and she saw their suffering with unflinching eyes. Where Charlotte chronicled ambition and Emily conjured passion, Anne chronicled life as it was, unvarnished, yet imbued with a profound compassion. Her novels, Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, were radical in their subtlety. Agnes Grey examined the plight of governesses, young women caught between two worlds, vulnerable to exploitation, yet bound by decorum. Anne's depiction of their isolation and resilience was informed by her own early experiences as a governess, and it resonated with readers who recognized, perhaps for the first time, the quiet oppression endured by so many women of her era. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall took her radicalism even further. Here, Anne dared to challenge the societal norms that dictated silence in the face of cruelty, particularly within marriage. Her heroine, Helen Graham, escapes a cruel husband and protects her child, asserting her right to dignity and self-respect in a world that insisted women endure suffering with quiet obedience. For Anne, writing was not merely art. It was moral witness. She was willing to confront scandal and social censure, to reveal truths that others would have preferred remain hidden. Her courage was quiet, but it cut deeper than any public rebellion. Anne's work reflected her keen observation, her intimate understanding of human nature, and her unwavering moral compass. She understood that cruelty could be subtle, a word, a gesture, a withheld kindness, and she understood that bravery often appeared in ordinary acts, leaving an abusive situation, defending the innocent, or speaking truth to power through the written word. Her novels, layered with realism, psychological insight, and ethical reflection, were revolutionary, not in bombast, but in their unshakable insistence on justice and empathy. The Brontë sisters' lives were intertwined, yet each sister inhabited a distinct world. Anne's domain was neither the wild moor nor the lofty literary ambition. It was the inner landscape of conscience and morality. Her writing revealed the subtle struggles of women, constrained by societal expectations, offering readers both reflection and guidance. Where Emily's genius lay in untamed emotion, and Charlotte's in intellectual ambition, Anne's lay in clarity of moral vision, a steady, luminous flame that illuminated injustices with serene precision. Anne's own life mirrored the quiet intensity of her fiction. She was diligent, disciplined, and thoughtful, her mind constantly turning over the questions of right and wrong. Her letters reveal a woman acutely aware of her responsibilities, both to herself and to those who might be influenced by her work. She was not flamboyant, and she did not seek fame, yet her influence would grow over time, touching readers who recognized the truth of her insight into human behavior. Her health, fragile as a candle flickering in the wind, never hindered her intellectual and creative pursuits. Even as tuberculosis loomed, she wrote with unwavering dedication. Her final years were spent in quiet reflection, caring for her sisters, and continuing to write, aware that the impact of her words might extend far beyond her own lifetime. She passed away in 1849, at the tender age of 29, leaving behind works that would endure, quietly revolutionary in their insistence on justice and human dignity. Anne's legacy is often overshadowed by the dramatic brilliance of her sisters. Emily's storms, Charlotte's ambition, these captured immediate attention.
Yet Anne's gentle radicalism resonates in ways that are subtle but profound. Her insistence on moral clarity, her ability to depict suffering without melodrama, and her courage to confront societal hypocrisy, quietly but forcefully, ensured that her voice would endure. Her novels remain relevant, not only for their insight into 19th century life, but for their timeless exploration of ethics, resilience, and compassion. The quiet brilliance of Anne Brontë reminds us that courage takes many forms. It is not always loud or conspicuous. Sometimes it is the quiet determination to speak truth in the face of indifference, to act with integrity when no one is watching, to hold fast to conscience even as the world presses conformity. In that sense, Anne's work is as vital now as it was in her lifetime. Her novels continue to inspire readers to examine their own values, their own courage, and their own humanity. In the tapestry of the Brontë sisters' lives, Anne represents the steady thread of moral insight, a luminous path through shadow, a reminder that even in quietness, there is profound strength. Her contribution to literature is not measured in dramatic flair, but in the depth of understanding, empathy, and justice she wove into every page. Anne Brontë, the quiet radical, remains a testament to the power of literature to illuminate, to challenge, and to endure, a serene yet unshakable presence in the ever-expanding world of human thought and imagination.
Section 12. The Brontes' Secret Lives, Letters, Poems, and Hidden Worlds. The Brontë sisters' public lives as authors reveal only part of their story. Behind the closed doors of Haworth Parsonage lay a private universe, rich with letters, poems, and imaginative worlds that the outside world would only glimpse decades later. In these secret creations, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne transformed ordinary experiences into extraordinary landscapes, exploring ambition, longing, love, and morality with a freedom that reality seldom allowed. Their letters, exchanged among themselves and with trusted friends, provide a window into the intimate lives of three young women navigating the strictures of Victorian society while simultaneously shaping their own literary destinies. Charlotte's letters are both practical and revealing, blending daily life with reflections on her creative process. She wrote of lessons she taught, of household chores, of struggles with ill health, but beneath the surface ran currents of aspiration and observation. Her letters reveal a sister deeply aware of her own ambitions and of the talents of those around her, particularly her younger sisters. Charlotte's affection for Emily and Anne is evident, tinged with protective instinct and admiration for their abilities. These letters capture the rhythm of life in Haworth, the wind howling over the moors, the austere stone walls of the parsonage, the intimate circle of family, and the way these external realities intertwined with inner worlds of imagination and creativity. Emily's letters, though fewer in number, reflect a mind uncommonly attuned to emotional and philosophical depth. She wrote sparingly, but each word carries a weight of reflection, a sensitivity to the natural world, and an awareness of human nature that resonates throughout Wuthering Heights. Her private correspondence demonstrates a retreat from the social demands of her era. favoring solitude and introspection. It is in these private letters that Emily's complex mind emerges, passionate yet disciplined, untamed yet deliberate, a person who observed the world with piercing clarity but engaged selectively with its demands. Her letters often reveal a sense of connection to the natural environment, the wild moors, not just as setting, but as a reflection of human emotion, a mirror for the inner landscapes she so vividly portrayed in fiction. Anne's correspondence, like her novels, is characterized by moral insight and clarity of thought. She writes of small details, a task completed, a visit from a neighbor, but these mundane observations often unfold into reflections on virtue, responsibility, and justice. Anne's letters reveal a mind continually weighing ethical considerations, seeking to understand both human frailty and human resilience. Her words, carefully chosen and precise, demonstrate a seriousness of thought that resonates through her novels, illustrating the inseparability of her private reflections and public expression. Beyond letters, the sisters' imaginative worlds, such as the fictional lands of Angria and Gondal, offer further insight into their private lives. These miniature kingdoms, initially created in elaborate stories shared in juvenile writings and family games, were complex in structure, complete with intricate politics, social hierarchies, and vivid landscapes. Through Angria, Charlotte explored power, ambition, and intrigue. Through Gondal, Emily delved into passion, conflict, and moral consequence. These worlds were not merely fanciful diversions. They were laboratories for thought, allowing the sisters to experiment with narrative, character, and emotional intensity in a context unbound by societal expectation. The act of world-building became a private sanctuary, a way to channel creativity while navigating the limitations imposed by their environment and by the roles expected of young women in the early 19th century. The interplay between these private creations and public work is striking. Themes explored in letters and fictional worlds, justice, morality, human suffering, ambition, and passion, reappear in their novels, often refined and intensified by experience and observation. The sisters' dedication to their imaginative pursuits, despite limited means, constrained opportunities, and the harsh realities of Haworth life, reflects a remarkable resilience and determination. Through letters, poems, and secretive storytelling, the Brontes not only entertained themselves, but also cultivated the skills, insight, and emotional depth that would define their enduring literary legacy. It is within this hidden life that the Brontes' genius takes its full shape. The public narrative of isolated, austere authors writing amidst bleak surroundings is accurate but incomplete. What is equally significant is their interior world, rich, layered, and ceaselessly inventive. The careful cultivation of personal reflection through letters, the experimentation in imaginative realms, and the moral contemplation evident in their early writings demonstrate a commitment to understanding human experience from multiple perspectives. In these private moments, the sisters honed empathy, sharpened intellect, and deepened emotional acuity, creating a foundation for the novels that would later captivate the literary world.
Even when faced with tragedy, the early deaths of siblings, the hardships of life in a harsh environment, and the constant awareness of societal limitations, the Brontes turned inward, using private writing as a refuge, a means of exploration, and a tool for creative growth. The letters, poems, and invented worlds preserved a sense of agency in an era when women's autonomy was limited, allowing the sisters to exercise control over narrative, morality, and destiny, even within the confines of their reality. Ultimately, the secretive literary and imaginative lives of the Brontes are as instructive as their published novels. They show the vital importance of private thought, creative exploration, and personal reflection in cultivating talent and resilience. The letters, poems, and invented worlds of Charlotte, Emily, and Anne are not just ancillary to their work. They are integral, revealing the depth of mind, spirit, and courage that underpinned every page they wrote for the world to read. In exploring these hidden realms, we gain insight not only into the creative genius of the Brontes, but also into the human capacity for imagination, reflection, and moral courage in the face of constraint, adversity, and loss. The Brontes' secret lives remind us that genius often grows quietly, in the unseen corners of daily life, nourished by reflection, observation, and a persistent drive to understand the world in all its complexity. Through letters, poems, and fictional worlds, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne cultivated a richness of thought and emotion that continues to resonate, proving that the private spaces we carve for creativity and reflection can illuminate the public legacies we leave behind.
Section 13, Tragedy and Triumph, the Sisters' Final Years. The final years of the Brontë sisters' lives were marked by a delicate balance between literary triumph and personal tragedy, a period that showcased both their extraordinary resilience and the fragility of human life in the 19th century. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne each faced illnesses, the harsh realities of Haworth, and the weight of family responsibilities. Yet in these same years, their literary voices reached unprecedented maturity and recognition. Charlotte's Jane Eyre, Emily's Wuthering Heights, and Anne's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall emerged not just as novels, but as profound statements of human emotion, moral questioning, and the unrelenting quest for understanding life's complexities. It is striking to consider how such remarkable literary accomplishments were forged in the midst of grief, deprivation, and the constant shadow of mortality that hung over the sisters' daily lives. Charlotte, often seen as the stabilizing figure among the siblings, faced the deaths of both Emily and Anne in quick succession, an emotional blow that was both devastating and transformative. Her mourning is reflected in letters and diaries filled with both sorrow and determination. Sorrow for what was lost, and determination to carry on the literary legacy of her sisters. During this period, Charlotte took on the role of caretaker, author, and protector of memory, ensuring that the works of Emily and Anne were published and preserved for posterity. Her own novels, written amidst grief, reveal an intensified depth of emotion and a heightened philosophical reflection, suggesting that personal loss had shaped a profound literary consciousness capable of exploring human experience in its most intimate and universal forms. Emily's final years were marked by retreat and reflection, she remained intensely private, focused on her writing and her connection to the natural world surrounding Haworth. Her health, always precarious, deteriorated, yet she continued to channel her intense emotional energy into her work, producing a legacy that would come to be recognized as some of the most innovative and passionate fiction of the Victorian era. Even in death, Emily's presence lingered in the creative consciousness of her surviving family, shaping both Charlotte's understanding of storytelling and the larger literary world's appreciation for novels that were daring in form, style, and emotional intensity. Anne, the youngest, endured illness for much of her life, yet she exhibited a remarkable clarity of moral vision in her writing and correspondence. Her final works reveal a commitment to social justice, human empathy, and ethical reflection, themes that resonate with readers even today. Anne's death, following Emily's, left Charlotte to shoulder the weight of family and literary preservation alone. Yet she did so with unwavering dedication, ensuring that the voices of all three sisters would continue to speak to future generations. The juxtaposition of their immense literary achievements with the brevity of their lives underscores a poignant truth. Genius and tragedy were inseparably intertwined in the Brontë family narrative. The sisters' final years also illustrate the intense struggle of balancing creativity with daily reality. The harsh climate of the Yorkshire moors, the austere life in the parsonage, and the societal constraints imposed upon women during the Victorian period made the pursuit of literary ambition a remarkable feat. That the Brontës managed to produce works of enduring brilliance in such an environment speaks not only to their intellectual gifts, but also to an inner resilience cultivated through years of hardship, imaginative play, and disciplined writing. Their lives reveal how the human spirit can persist in creating beauty, meaning, and reflection, even in the face of relentless external challenges. Charlotte's eventual survival and literary prominence allowed her to reflect on the lives and deaths of her sisters with an awareness both tender and analytical. Her posthumous efforts to memorialize Emily and Anne, coupled with her own continued writing, established the Brontë legacy firmly in the annals of English literature. Through biographies, letters, and her own works, Charlotte conveyed not just the narratives her sisters had created, but also the profound emotional and philosophical worlds that had informed their creations. She preserved the inner lives, imaginative experiments, and moral inquiries of the Brontës, ensuring that the quiet yet powerful genius of three women from a remote parsonage could resonate across centuries. Ultimately, the story of the Brontë sisters' final years is both tragic and triumphant. Tragic in the sense of their premature deaths, the grief that enveloped their family, and the relentless hardships of their lives. Triumphant in the enduring literary contributions they left behind, the innovative emotional and narrative structures they developed, and the testament their lives provide to human resilience and creativity. Their legacy is a reminder that profound artistic expression often emerges not in spite of adversity, but through it, that the pressures of reality, the weight of expectation, and the inevitability of loss can sharpen the mind and illuminate the depths of imagination and feeling. The Brontës' lives, in their brevity and intensity, demonstrate that the act of creating, writing, imagining, reflecting, can be a form of immortality, preserving the essence of human thought and emotion for generations to come. As we close the story of the Brontë sisters, we are left with a vision of creativity, thriving in the quietest and most constrained of spaces, where letters, poems, and novels emerged from the solitude of Haworth to transform the literary world forever. Their lives remind us that genius is not always born in grandeur or comfort, but often in intimate, hidden spaces where imagination meets resilience and where the heart's passions find their voice on the page. Even amidst tragedy, the Brontës created worlds that continue to speak, to challenge, and to inspire, a timeless testament to the enduring power of human creativity.